Hello, puppies and kittens. I have someone who's currently identifying as Stringy Brain. We're just going to go with that because it makes me giggle. But he is going to explain to me about. Let me put it another way. I saw a presentation by Bill Nye, a live presentation wherein he was adamantly against nuclear power. And some people would say very alarmist things, but I would see it as deep concern. I remain unconvinced. I don't know a hell of a lot about physics, so don't all start jumping on me. Oh, I can't believe you how little you know. Well, fuck off. So, so Stringy Brain is going to help me out with this and explain to me why nuclear power is a safe option.
Absolutely.
Okay, go ahead, please.
So I want to start with saying that I think a lot of the conversation around nuclear power is very emotional in terms of, I think fear drives a lot of the public discussion about nuclear. And I think a lot of that fear is justified. I think nuclear power is an extremely powerful technology, and we have to use it in a very intelligent way.
And when it goes bad, it goes so bad.
Right. And I want to address that. I do. But I think it's important to not be hypocritical in the way we treat nuclear power in respect to the other energy sources that mankind has taken advantage of. Right? So when we talk about safety, I think that we really need to, and it sounds like a very cold calculation, but I think we do need to quantify the number of lives lost per unit energy that we gain from nuclear power. And like I said, this sounds like a very cold calculation to make.
It sounds worse than that.
Right. But unfortunately, if we are to have a serious discussion and talk about how we are going to satisfy humanity's need for an energy source, we simply have to make this calculation. And I mean, let's take a step back and contextualize this.
I gotta tell you that it's not starting on the right foot.
Right, and I get that, but let's say, I mean, let's just take what we use now. I mean, we use coal, and we use natural gas, and we use oil for the vast majority of humanity's needs. And if you just look at how much deaths are directly responsible, putting aside even the climate aspect of the effects of fossil fuels, we already see that coal itself kills maybe 100,000 people every year directly. Whereas in the entirety of nuclear power, even including the 3 major accidents, we have had, by the worst estimate, approximately 5,000 deaths. And that's the absolute worst estimate. It's more likely much lower. And again, this is perhaps the most...
This is not going to dissuade anybody who's seen the pictures of the malformed children in Belarus and such things. I mean, you don't need a very long memory to reach back to, what was it, 2014 to Fukushima? I realize a lot of alarmist sensationalism about that, right, but it wasn't entirely unjustified.
Right. No, and I get that, but you bring up Fukushima, and I think we should address that. Fukushima is one of the only other incidents listed in nuclear history as being as bad as Chernobyl, which I think was ridiculous. But again, I don't know how the organization that ranks these disasters, what they're called, what qualifications they use to rank these disasters. But let's address Fukushima, because I think that's important. Fukushima had 0 deaths directly related to the incident. All deaths related to Fukushima were from the evacuation of the nearby area. And as far as we can tell, the World Health Organization has said they expect no increases in cancer, no increases in any type of birth defects from Fukushima. The vast majority of the radiation was spread into the Pacific Ocean. And again, no amount of radiation leak is ideal. We want to keep these things as isolated as possible. But I think Fukushima is, I mean, to be fair, it's overblown. It is a major accident. It is an unfortunate major accident. But if we look at the details of what happened, okay? An earthquake happened, 9 magnitude earthquake. Immediately, as soon as the reactors detected this earthquake, they, what is called scrammed. It just means an instant shutoff, or as much of an instant shutoff as you can have with nuclear power. Now, the problem with nuclear power power, inherent to the physics of nuclear power, is that when you shut off a reactor, about anywhere from 6 to 7% of the main power of the reactor is still running. It's in the decay heat of the fuel itself. So the fuel remains very, very hot and continues to rise in temperature. Now, usually this is controlled through a coolant while the reactor is running. But when you scram the reactor or shut it down, as was done in Fukushima, you must provide some kind of cooling to the fuel. Otherwise, it will melt down. The zirconium will release hydrogen. You will get a hydrogen explosion. You will expose the core. You don't want to do this. This is what happened in Fukushima. They were unable to provide that auxiliary power because the tsunami that came flooded the diesel generators, which were kept in the basement. Which, by the way, not a good place to keep diesel generators if you're going to build a nuclear power plant by the ocean. Just not a smart idea. So
I would think that Japan is not a good place to be.
Agreed. You want to avoid putting these reactors in unsafe conditions. But I think that offshore is by far and away the best place because you can avoid exactly this Fukushima incident where you have, because in deep waters, the wavelength of tsunamis is very large. So a tsunami could pass you and you would barely notice. It's when it gets closer to shore that you really have problems. You really start noticing these massive waves, these massive tidal waves, tons and tons of water moving in. So Fukushima, bad accident, don't want it to happen. And you're absolutely right. When these things go bad, they are spectacularly bad. But I think it is somewhat like the airplane phenomenon, where people are absolutely terrified sometimes to get onto an airplane, right? Because what happens when an airplane crashes? It's absolutely catastrophic. Hundreds of people die, hours and hours and hours of news coverage, right? And so it imparts on people this notion that is extremely dangerous, that you're extremely likely to die in an airplane crash. But just looking at the numbers, we know that's just simply not true. You're much more likely to die on your average car ride to the local corner market than you are in any particular plane crash, right? Than you are in any particular plane flight.
Again, it's not a very strong argument the way you're going. It's like the preface of it.
Right. Okay. Well, I guess what I can't, it's very difficult for me to, because we have to quantify safety somehow. We can't just say, okay, well, let's completely ignore this very vital technology that I think, personally, opinion time, is absolutely vital in our battle against climate change and in our future of having a green energy grid that is stable, reliable, and CO2 free.
Okay, I don't even think that this is just a matter of opinion. I'm going to completely agree with you. Okay, we know that coal is a limited resource and it's running out.
Absolutely.
And it's dangerous and it's polluting. I mean, there's and we know that no matter what, we can't stay with coal. We could love coal to death, and we can't stay with it. So there's got to be something else. And if we can't do a quick transition, then I'm looking at nuclear as being a transit or transitional mode. Now, so what you gave a moment ago was like putting something offshore. I don't know how you would do that, but you said to avoid the damage of tsunamis. I think there's other ways you could protect against tsunamis. I mean, you have diesel run generators. That already seems to be a problem. If you have something that's going to be running on, why not have an electricity store? I mean, it's a damn generator. Surely it can run enough electricity to power batteries. We can have some Tesla motors with 800 horsepower turning these things to pump out whatever we need, right? I mean, so there's offering solutions to the pre-existing problem or to the problem that had happened. How could we have avoided that in the future? That's more what I would prefer to. It's not that many people.
And what I suggested, putting them offshore, is a specific way to avoid things like tsunami. So specifically to address the Fukushima incident. Now, ideally, you're absolutely right. We would have passive safety systems that bypass all of this. So you don't ever need to worry about, well, if my electricity to my power plant gets cut off, how do I cool my core? Ideally, the very design of your power plant would be such that if power gets cut off in the event that you need to scram, i.e. shut down the reactor, you can control that decay heat without needing some active cooling system, which a lot of our reactors need right now. And I agree with you. This is extremely outdated technology.
I will say we can actually run what you were talking about, generators. we don't need the generators because we can run things on what has become electric car batteries or something of that capacity.
Right. No, it's absolutely possible that you have some other form of cooling. The problem is that we need absolute reliability. So we need to be able to turn on something right away that can cool the core and make sure that it stays cool. Now, you're right. Generators are not ideal because, again, that's a fossil fuel. And secondly, you have things like if it gets flooded, if you don't have access to your generators, if they break down for whatever reason. These are all major concerns. Absolutely. And again,
a fully electric battery operated system would still run underwater.
Yes. The details here we can absolutely discuss. And I think that having newer systems that have passive cooling rather than needing to rely on any type of active system where you need to be there operating it, I think that's the best way to go. But again, let me preface all of this by saying this is in the context of water-cooled current day solid fuel reactors. Now that's a mouthful, but again, most current reactors are solid fuel reactors that have the possibility of meltdown. Many newer designs that are proposed have liquid fuels that, they can't melt. They're already liquid, right? So you don't have that problem. And that is a passive safety issue built in. Now, do they have their own issues? Absolutely. But you can totally mitigate the ability of the fuel to melt and be a problem for you. Now, this is just addressing safety, right? And I think, again, we have to quantify the safety. Because you're right, it's not even a matter of opinion. Fossil fuels are a limited resource. We have to get off them, even putting aside the climate issue, right? It's simply a limited issue. These issues we do not run into these issues when approaching nuclear power. The fuel is, if done correctly, essentially unlimited, or at least you're talking on a timescale vastly outdoing human civilization, right?
Okay, so what are the major issues with nuclear power? Apart from the potential disaster. I can't remember the details, even though you'd think I would because I've seen so much stuff about Chernobyl, but I can't remember what actually initially went wrong.
Okay, so in Chernobyl, you had essentially the perfect storm, and I really do mean this. You have on every level both human incompetence, terrible regulation, and a safety culture in the Soviet Union regarding Soviet reactors. And again, we have those problems too. I don't mean to be, picking on the Russians or anything, right? Every country has these issues with regulation, especially when you have very powerful corporate interests who run these reactors, who want to save every dime that they can, so they cut every corner they can. And I think these are very important issues to address. But one of the main concerns for me personally about nuclear is the safety issue. That is my number one concern as well. I don't mean to dismiss it out of hand or to seem glib or flippant about the safety issue. It is a major issue and the number one issue with energy, any power source, right? That's one issue. The second issue is the fuel, the waste that we will generate. I think that can be handled. I think that is less of a scientific issue and more, again, a political and public opinion issue, the dealing with the waste. And then a third thing that ties into safety is non-proliferation. So we never want nuclear material to end up in bad faith actors' hands, right? That's also a huge concern. But that can be dealt with and has been dealt with. Let me give you just one example. France, for decades, has run the vast majority of its electric grid on nuclear power. And they also do something called reprocessing, which is where they take spent fuel, extract the plutonium, and then reintroduce plutonium into the reactors to reuse as more fuel. And this poses a major proliferation issue and why it is not done here in the US. We do not reprocess our fuel here. Once it's spent, once the fuel bundle is spent, we basically store it and we try to find a solution for long-term storage.
Well, that's because our natural tendency is to use up disposable items and throw them away.
Absolutely.
That's the American way.
Absolutely, right? Who cares about recycling, right? Absolutely. But so I think those are three of the most major issues in my opinion. So let me go over that again. Safety, the fuel or the waste that will be generated, and then the proliferation issues. But I think
we also should bring up environmental impact. Now I have no idea what with the liquid fuel you're talking about, how that changes anything, but I remember there being huge concerns for the way that the way nuclear waste is generated and what do we do with it.
Right. So let me address the liquid fuel issue real quick. So right now, like I said, the vast majority of our reactors are solid fuel. Now, what we do is we essentially take uranium, we either enrich it or don't, depending on the design of the reactor, and then we mix it into a ceramic. And you can look up these little, they're called fuel pellets. They're literally about this big, and you put a zirconium rod, and you essentially fill them with these little ceramic pellets of uranium, okay? Now, the problem is they're ceramic, so they're solid, and when they get hot enough, they will melt. And if they get really hot, they'll even melt the zirconium containing them. And when that happens, the very hot water, which is what vast majority of we use to cool the core, the hot water will react with the zirconium, release hydrogen, and as we know, hydrogen being an extremely flammable gas, there's a potential there to explode and rip apart the core. This is a major issue, and why it is absolutely vital that in the event of a nuclear reactor shutdown, you must continue to cool the core. We usually do that through backup generators. We can also do that by connecting it to offsite grid, so that we can have the offsite grid provide the power needed to run the pumps, right? With liquid fuel, you can avoid the meltdown completely because the fuel itself is already in a molten state as it's being used. Now you say, well, what happens if there's a situation where we need to shut down the reactor? What do we do with this liquid fuel? Well, liquid fuel requires what's called a moderator. Without the moderator, the reactor doesn't run, okay? The details aren't very important, but let's say that you have a liquid fueled reactor. Well, one proposal is all you need to do is have a freeze plug. You freeze a little, essentially a drain. You freeze a drain constantly using some kind of electric power, usually the power from the power plant itself. And in the event that power gets shut off to the reactor, the freeze plug will melt and you can literally drain the fuel out into a containment chamber where it won't react anymore because, like I said, the fuel doesn't just react by itself. It requires a very specific design, right? And I think this is something important. Nuclear reactors are not nuclear bombs. They're actually radically designed differently. Comparing a nuclear reactor to a nuclear bomb is almost essentially the same as comparing a coal plant to a normal conventional Moab bomb or something, right? They both take it.
We saw this. There was a documentary that was, very well done as far as being a dramatic human story, of drama and everything. But unfortunately, it was neither historically nor scientifically accurate. I hate when they do this. When they take an when they take a real thing that really happened and they stamp the words, "This is a true story," and then they start changing things.
Mm.
And sometimes there's significant things that they change. I mean, some things for the context of the story, I could see leaving out or sewing together in a maybe a tighter sequence, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Leaving out how many times they went for coffee or talked about other things before they got back to the subject. It doesn't have to be verbatim, but I hate when they change significant things like the science in this case, where they were talking about Chernobyl. And one of the things they were talking about was that the core was exposed and it was producing this beam of light into the sky that if you flew a helicopter over it, the helicopter would melt.
Yeah, a little bit too dramatic there. Was there odd lights? That's very possible because when you release large amounts of something very radioactive, right? And let me quantify what I mean by that in a second. But when you release large amounts of very radioactive material, the air itself can be ionized, meaning electrons can be ripped or distributed out of the molecules of the air. And this can generate very odd sources of light. So, but the melting helicopter that's a little bit too much. And maybe it could have.
Another thing that they said was that if they didn't avert this crisis immediately, that they were going to kill Europe.
Yeah, that's a little bit too extreme. What would have happened is a large spread of radioactive material, not ideal. Most likely would have seen very sharp increases in specific types of cancer, like thyroid cancer, because of the radioactive iodine, stuff like this. No, unlikely to kill all of Europe. Terrible disaster. And there was a reason that we needed those divers to go into the water and essentially relieve that pressure. Because what was happening was, like I said, these fuel bundles are ceramic wrapped around zirconium rods. So when it melts, it essentially forms a liquid ceramic, so like a lava, basically. And as with any extremely hot liquid, if you pour it onto a large amount of water, you're going to get a huge steam explosion. This steam explosion would have been particularly bad because the steam explosion would have spread, again, the radioactive core across a huge area, right? But let me address Chernobyl, because I think most people don't even realize that huge parts of the exclusion zone have lower levels of radiation than like natural radiation, like in Denver. You know what I mean? Like so the hypocrisy that runs in nuclear is very large. One example, if you take Nuclear Regulatory Commission standards for how much radiation a nuclear power plant is allowed to release, if you held that to every single power generating plant, you would have to shut down every coal plant in the entire country and probably the entire world. They release extremely large amounts of radiation into the air, but nobody talks about this. Nobody talks about the fact that when you burn coal, you release things like radon, like uranium, which is trapped in the coal. You release things like polonium trapped in the coal. All of these are extremely radioactive, right? And in much larger amounts than when you run a nuclear power plant. So again, we have to quantify scientifically the dangers here, right? So how many lives are we losing, and what is the benefit? And I think when it comes to coal and gas and the other fossil fuels, the trade-off is simply not worth it. It's just not to me, right?
Well, I've been looking at just situations of like cumulative pollution since like the 1970s, or since probably 1970, because I'm an old guy. And I remember that I seemed to be alone in recognizing that humans could even impact the environment at all, or that it was going to be cumulative, that things were going to get worse. And so everybody was telling me that, people in my family, for example, they believed that every resource was infinite, that we could. I don't know how you could think that. They also thought that it was impossible for any species to go extinct. Somehow God protects them. If you kill everyone in one area, there's still some on some forgotten island somewhere. They can never go extinct. This is the kind of thinking. Okay, when you think about that, we're thinking about our major administrations are run by people who think that these are the end times. They want to bring about prophecies for the end of the world, and they're going to be funding and financing nuclear power.
Right, and I think you're right there. We have a very odd culture that is infused with so many elements of Christian fundamentalism in the United States, and it's extremely unfortunate. See, I wasn't born here, so it's very hard for me to wrap my mind around a nation so steeped in this type of religious fundamentalism. And I don't mean to pick particularly on the Christians; they're just the most powerful ones here, so we pick on them. But no, I think you're right. I think the culture around it has to be addressed. I don't know how to do it, and I think you're doing fantastic work. I love your channel. I think your classifications, systematic classification series is, it's one of the best and most easily accessible resources for anybody out there. Please check that out, audience, if you haven't. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I wonder, but I have no idea how to begin addressing this.
What I'm saying here is that there's a whole lot more problems than what we're talking about. It's not just the practical matters; it's the impractical administration, and as you said, that even at the grassroots, the culture. It's like people are not going to be behind nuclear power because it is so incredibly devastating, and because the movies lie to us when they give these representations, and then we don't trust the government already. Right, which is already a corporatocracy, which is you have
absolutely.
Out, we're going to be doing everything according to the lowest bidder to cut every corner possible, and then
absolutely.
And this is for people who have absolutely no respect for science whatsoever, and so most of this will never even get done because there's still more profit in coal.
I agree. I think you're absolutely right, and I don't mean to say that this will be an easy transition. I think it will have to be one of the most difficult coordinated efforts that mankind has ever taken. I really do. If we are serious about addressing this climate issue, you're right. We will have to take on some of the most powerful interests in the world, like you said.
If we're serious, think about how hard it is to get anybody to take responsibility up just above themselves, and much less hold their government accountable.
No, I agree with you. I don't know what to do in terms of the politics. I think it's a very difficult question because in particular you need a very a government responsible to the people. And like you said, our government is simply not responsible to people. It's not. I mean, public opinion has what, like, statistical noise in terms of an effect on public policy. I mean, public opinion has essentially no effect on public policy.
Virtually none, yeah.
Virtually none, you're right. And you say corporatocracy. I think that's a wonderful word and an extremely accurate word to describe not only the United States, but I mean, most industrialized nations are completely corporate captured, right? I mean,
it's funny that everybody's afraid of the new world order, but they don't realize that they're already living in it.
Right. I mean, there's one government, and that government's capital. Like, I mean, the money
Exactly.
rules. Yes.
Exactly.
No, the money rules. You're absolutely right. And but I think there are examples we can take. Like I said, France seems to be doing a very good job. Even though you're absolutely right, there is still corporate capture there. I mean, it's absolute in terms of it's a capital. Go ahead.
Let me ask just one more technical question, because you may have explained this, but I think I missed it. When we're using water to cool, well, that actually leads me to a couple of questions. I don't know how water manages to cool these things down, because you said that it'll continue to heat until it explodes the water, yet we're using water to cool it. What else are we using to cool it?
There are a few options. You can use supercritical CO2. You can use different things. The interesting part about nuclear power is, like,
but don't they typically use water?
Absolutely, the vast majority use water. Vast majority.
Do you see where I'm confused?
Yes. So I'm not sure how much background I should bring into here. So please stop me at any time to expand upon anything.
Okay, but my second part, and just in case you cover it, the second part of that question is, what do we do with the water now that it's been used to cool that and is now irradiated itself?
Right. So most reactors have what are called multiple loops. The primary loop is exactly as you said. Water runs through. It'll run through the core, heat up, either flash to steam or stay as very hot but pressurized water. And then it runs to a heat exchanger. And then a secondary loop has clean water. And that is what runs into the turbine and the condenser and then cools off. And then the water. You see where I'm going with that?
Well, that just leads me to a third question then. You introduce clean water, and people who know what they're talking about, people who know what you're talking about, are probably laughing at me because I don't. But
no. And again, I'm absolutely no expert, so I just want to put that out there. Please fact check anything I say.
When you introduce the clean water, well, so now you've got clean water and you've got dirty water, and you've got a process that creates dirty water and has to keep involving clean water. Do you see how that's cumulative?
No, because the first loop traps the dirty water, the exposed water, and and ideally, if there are no failures in the design, there will be no leakage of that water. That water will continue to circulate for the lifetime of the plant, right?
Does it ever become safe again?
It really depends on how you define safe. But okay, I would say
you're cooling radioactive elements with now radiated water, right? Mm. The water does become radioactive itself.
It depends on what you mean by that. Does do the H2O molecules themselves become radioactive? No, very unlikely.
I'd already deduced that much on my own.
Right, but does the water pull elements and other chemicals and substances?
So how do you purify the water from the plant?
It's very likely that you would have to use some kind of chemical process. The details here are very complicated and technical, but again, ideally you don't have to deal too much with that first loop, that primary loop.
Well, we're talking about cumulative now. So if you're going to bring in, if you have a process that constantly needs clean water, then you have to constantly clean the water you started with.
No. The clean water is in the secondary loop that does not touch the first loop. The only place where they intersect is a heat exchanger. So you run dirty but very hot and pressurized water in the first loop, the one that actually touches the core, and then let's say you would wrap another pipe around, or a heat exchanger, right? The design is actually quite ingenious, but essentially you can extract thermal energy out of the dirty water by running cool water on a separate pipe through a heat exchanger, not needing them to interact and touch. Do you see? Does that make a little bit of sense?
So you're never bringing in clean water that then becomes dirty.
Right. And like I said, the details here are complicated, but you're right. Ideally, the first primary loop would not be exposed to, would not either leak out into the environment or need to be replenished too much, right?
Okay,
ideally,
eventually you're gonna recycle that same dirty water indefinitely for the life of the plant, as you said.
Again, the details here are complicated. You may need to switch out that water. Again, there may be certain tolerances that regulations require. Like it may be once the water is a certain amount of contaminated, you may need to store it, right? Just like any other waste. That is absolutely a possibility. The details here are complicated.
Okay, I appreciate that. But if you're storing water, that doesn't seem to be, again, being cumulative. Water is a precious resource, so we should be purifying that so that we can recycle it, right?
I agree. And I think that there are better designs than using water-cooled solid fuel reactors. As a matter of fact, these are relics from when nuclear power started decades ago, right?
Okay,
nuclear power,
liquid-cooled, does not use water?
The liquid fuel?
Yeah.
No. The liquid fuel will either use maybe a supercritical gas. It could use a molten salt, like molten sodium, something like this. There are proposals out there to get away from more conventional water-cooled reactors, especially in places like Saudi Arabia or other places where you may not have ready access to lots and lots of water. Please. Okay, well,
good, but that just leads me to more questions. You said that these are proposals, so I was under the impression that these liquid fuel reactors were already in use somewhere.
No. Like I said, the vast majority are solid fuels, and they almost always use water, either pressurized water reactors or boiling water reactors. Now, there are very few reactors that use CO2 to cool themselves. That can be expanded. Ideally, we would, in my opinion, move away from solid fuels, avoid a lot of the problems and headaches of nuclear power. But no, most liquid fuels are not currently in existence, or if they are, they're very experimental. They're not for large-scale utility civilian use.
Then we can't really call it an available technology yet.
Well, I would say not in terms of like we haven't implemented it large scale, but I think the technology is there and should be researched and funded to expand to larger scales. Like we understand the physics and the engineering that goes into it. The problem is can we scale it up to utility level, right? But even in worst case scenario, even if we needed to expand every single solid fuel reactor to cover the entire world's energy supply, that is feasible. That is absolutely feasible, economically speaking and safety wise.
Yeah, but then you got to get turned into the issue of can we make it commercial? Because if it's not commercial, then nobody's going to do it, which is also the reason we shouldn't make it commercial, because of how that's going to be corrupted.
I think you bring up a fantastic point, but I think there are good examples out there in the world right now of countries who, even though they are capitalist, essentially hellholes, right? They're still have had enough government regulation and enough that they have done well with nuclear. So I always bring up France because, in my opinion, they're a model for the world in terms of their energy, right? So just to give an example, I live in New Mexico. My state is 35 times smaller in terms of population than France, and yet France only emits 7 times as much of greenhouse gas emissions. And that has to do with the fact that the vast majority of their electric grid is nuclear. And they've done this for a very long time. They've streamlined the process. So when they started implementing these fleets of nuclear reactors, they said, you're not going to do a bunch of different random designs and then submit it to the government for licensing and for each and every one. No, we're going to license one, and then you're going to mass produce those, and then you're going to make sure they're all run the same way. And as far as we know, France has had no major incidents. They reprocess their fuel. They haven't had any proliferation issues. They haven't had any nuclear material go missing, as far as I know, right? No major accidents in decades. So, I mean, there are examples of countries who do it very well. Now, I wish they would go further. I wish they would go 100% instead of 70% of their grid is nuclear, right? So I wish the rest of that, instead of being covered by fossil fuels and other stuff, I wish that would be also nuclear. And again, when I advocate for nuclear power, that is not to say I don't believe in the renewables, solar and wind. I think those will also be vital to our fight against climate change and our new future grid. But I'm very hesitant to dismiss any technology out of hand just because people don't understand it or because people are scared of it, right? And I think the case with nuclear, please.
There's a lot of objection to the renewables too from people who just seem to be obvious shills for the fossil fuel industry when they tell me that there's not enough lithium in the world to build enough batteries. I mean, seriously? I mean, it's not like that's the only battery technology anyway. But it's only the third. I think it's the third element on the periodic table. It can't be that rare.
No, it's very common, and there are genuine critiques and criticisms and problems with the renewables. But again, you're right. You have to have an intelligent and nuanced conversation about them. People who say, "Oh, but the sun doesn't shine anywhere," that is a genuine critique if you apply a nuanced and intelligent conversation to that. But if you just say that as like you say, as a fossil fuel paid, talking mouth, then yeah, that's not a genuine critique if you're going to approach it from that.
So would you say would you say that we will ever be like 100% on renewables?
No,
solar, tides.
No, I find that extremely unlikely, and let me tell you why. When you set down a wind or solar farm, you almost always, and please check me on this, you almost always have either natural gas turbines built in to account for slack periods, or you have an integrated grid where you borrow energy from nearby towns, cities, states, countries when you have slack periods, when your supply is not meeting the demands of the energy grid, right? And we have very strict requirements for the stability of the grid. We just do. And the renewables are not good for what's called base load power, which is just power that runs all the time, 24/7, like a coal power plant or a nuclear power plant. They're fantastic base load, right? They don't do well when you need to fluctuate power a lot, right? Gas turbines are much better for that. If you need to quickly ramp up power or whatever.
But we're talking about storing energy.
No, and again, storage is another big issue. I don't know so much if it's a matter of we don't have enough lithium or something, but it's just a matter of like our battery technology is there. If you look at even our best energy densities, so let's say megajoules per kilogram, right? Excuse me. In terms of megajoules per kilogram, batteries technology is just not there for us to store what we need for large-scale utility use, right? Now, there are other ways of storage. You can pump water up, right? While you have excess energy, you can pump water up and then use the gravitational stored energy there to recoup that energy when you have slack periods. That's one possibility. You can heat something, right? You can store it as heat in some material. That's another way to do it. And I think the renewables are very, very good for places that have tons of access to the sun, that have tons of access to wind, right? But for other places, we will either need to have an overcapacity, meaning we'll need to build much, much more so that even if, let's say, your solar farm is only running at 10% maximum capacity, right, for that day, you can still cover all the supply or the demand. We may either need to overbuild, or we will need to improve storage, like you said. We could also do an integrated grid where when demand is slack, we can pull in power from another location. I think that's also a possibility. But again, these all require major changes to infrastructure, major changes in technology, much more so than I think if you just relax the requirement on nuclear power a little bit. I think a nuclear, solar, and wind future is absolutely within reach and very, very likely to be humanity's best shot at long-term sustainability for our energy sector.
Okay, thank you for that. We are having this conversation, you and I, because I talked about this with somebody else recently, and you wanted to put it in some clarification. So I'm going to invite that we do that again. That somebody else watching this video may, of course, want to come in with some more clarifications or whatever.
Absolutely, and I welcome that.
Yeah, as I do too. So I'm open to this to have this discussion at least one more time, and we'll see how productive it is then. But thank you very much, Stringy Brain, for helping to enlighten me.
Of course, yeah. And I invite you to just read a little bit about it, just research it a little bit, and you'll find that by any objective measure, if you're not being hypocritical in the standards you apply across all energy sectors, right, across all sources, you will find that nuclear is one of the safest options. If done right, it is incredibly clean, minimal impact on the environment. I shouldn't say no, but minimal impact, because like you said, we have to mine the uranium and so on and so forth. And it ties a lot into politics. I think you're right. There is a whole side to that we have to address, right? But I think this is one of our best shots. It really is. It's one of our best shots at addressing climate change.
No, as far as the renewable energy, like solar, for example, I mean, you're in New Mexico. 60% of that state could be a solar farm.
I agreed, but again, you have to remember what happens, and I don't mean this in a disingenuous way. What happens when you don't have access to the sun? Now, you say we could do storage. That is a possibility. But remember, things like hospitals, fridges, and just many parts of people's lives, they have to run 24/7, just the way we've set them up. There is no point where you can say, oh, well, sorry, hospital, we need to shut your electricity off for 8 hours. It's not going to work, right?
I was just in South Africa a month or so ago, and in Johannesburg, they've had this situation for more than a decade where they will just randomly turn off power to whole neighborhoods.
Right.
What we call brownouts. Now, they did that in my town 15 years ago. That was, remember, at the time when they did it because they had the grid was overwhelming the production. So they fixed the problem. They provided more resources to produce more power. But for whatever reason, Johannesburg didn't fix that problem. They're still doing, 13 years later, still doing brownouts of everybody's neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it's amazing. You know what the problem is. You know what the solution is. Why are you not fixing it?
No, and I absolutely agree. Vietnam, too. I'm from Vietnam. I've been there. They do that regularly. They'll just randomly, for hours, cut off all electricity. I can't imagine it. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine us doing that on a large global scale. I mean, just imagine the chaos there. Imagine the backlash from the public when we begin to implement, let's say we sideshoe nuclear. We say we're not going to do that at all. If we do pure solar and wind, you're going to have massive public outcry and backlash when you have huge sectors of our grid just browning out. Or you're going to invest unbelievable amounts of money to do an integrated grid essentially across the entire world, because you need the entire world to have an integrated grid if you're going to do pure solar and wind. I mean, and it's not a matter of there's not enough sun. I don't want to make it seem like we don't have the sun. The sun. I mean, the sun gives so much energy to the earth. Like a small section of the Sahara Desert is enough to literally power the entire globe. But again, let's say we did that in our imaginary world where we somehow got the countries of the Sahara enough political unity and stability to agree to provide the entire world with the integrated grid. It's just, I don't see that happening. I see that as much more difficult than just implementing large-scale nuclear.
Well, I think the bigger problem is very similar to what you were just talking about. I mean, they wanted to set up a solar farm in West Texas, which is very similar to New Mexico, just vast areas of open desert and just intense sunlight, 115 degrees Fahrenheit, not uncommon at all. It's just absolutely baking. And you can store that energy, which would be brilliant. So when you have these surplus periods, you're storing up, and then when you have a depleted period or when it's cloudy for days on end, well, then everything's in battery storage is the way I would think that's going to work. But this town where they proposed building this solar farm, which would have provided jobs, it would have improved a great deal of things for the town itself. They voted against it because they thought their solar farm would drain the sun.
I mean, and I don't even know how to begin addressing that. That is a failure, a systemic failure on so many levels, from our education system to I'm in
charge.
Right. I mean, the people with power, right? And it's amazing to me, right? How can we rely on the people to hold the government accountable if the people have no idea what's going on? I mean, they can barely wrap their minds around a solar farm, and I'm asking them to wrap their mind around one of the most complicated technical sources of energy we could possibly tap into, right? And so I agree with you. This is a major problem, and I'm honestly not quite sure how to address it. I mean, what are your thoughts on this? Like, what do you think?
I know so little about this that I have no thoughts on it. I prefer not to talk about things I don't know anything at all about. And I can't just go look it up and research it, because that's pretty much all I do anyway. As soon as I get off this call, I'm going to be back in my homework because I've got a final assignment that's due tonight.
Oh,
so
wow.
That's just all I do. So, I mean, I really literally don't have the time to do that anymore. I want to thank you for coming in to have this conversation, and people will continue that in the comments, but also I would be interested in hearing this again. I know that there are other people perhaps with credentials and so forth that might want to come in and, as I said, provide more clarification or what have you. I'm interested in the conversation. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and close it out. Do you have anything you want to say? Final comments? How to promote yourself or whatever?
No, I don't want to plug myself for anything. I want to plug you mostly. Love your channel, but yeah, no, just I encourage people to look into it. Have an intelligent and nuanced view of nuclear power. Try not to let your innate fear of things you don't understand stop you from pursuing something that I think is very, very important to our energy future. And somebody with more expertise, please come on to Aaron's channel, or Aaron's channel, and clarify some of the things I'm saying, give some more detail, some more sources, some more facts. And again, thank you so much for having me on.
And anything that either of us missed. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
See ya.